The first thing I understood, coming up out of the anesthesia, was the ceiling tile with the water stain shaped like Florida. The second thing I understood, 5 days later, was that my sister had been signing my name. I spent 9 years building something with my own 2 hands while my family treated it like a hobby I'd eventually grow out of. If you've ever had people wait around for you to fail so they could finally take you seriously, drop a comment, because you already know exactly the kind of story this is. I'm a caterer. 9 years ago, I started my company, Edward's Table, out of a rented commercial kitchen with 2 sheet pans and a laminated menu I'd designed myself. And by the year of my surgery, it had grown into a full events business. Weddings, corporate galas, the occasional fundraiser, pulling in $480,000 in revenue the year before everything happened. I built the client list personally, negotiated every vendor contract myself, and kept my own financial backups going back to the first season. Because I'd watched too many small businesses lose everything to one corrupted hard drive to ever trust just one copy of anything. My sister Amber helped out at big events sometimes, folding napkins, running a card table, but she'd never signed a lease, never fired a vendor, never once stayed until 2 in the morning scrubbing out a walk-in after a wedding ran long. I built Edward's Table entirely alone. I just never expected I'd have to prove it. Our father, Carl, ran a well-regarded steakhouse for 30 years before he retired, and everything in our family got measured, whether anyone said so out loud or not, against whether it would have impressed him at the height of that restaurant. Amber worked the front of house for him as a teenager and never really left the industry's social orbit. She waited tables, then managed a wine bar, then drifted between hospitality jobs that always seemed to end in someone else's decision, not hers. I was the one who actually built something with a balance sheet, and for reasons I never fully understood, that made me easier to overlook at the dinner table than she was. 6 years ago, Amber asked me for $8,000 to cover a security deposit and 2 months rent on an apartment after a relationship ended badly. I wired it to her on a Tuesday afternoon without asking many questions, because that's what I did. I was the sister with a business account and steady cash flow. And steady cash flow, in our family, came with an unspoken obligation to share it. She told me at the time she'd pay it back within the year. 4 years later, at a 4th of July barbecue at our parents' house, she mentioned in passing that she was finally debt-free, and when I asked, lightly, whether that included me, she laughed and said, "Come on, Monica, that wasn't a loan, that was just you being you." The dismissiveness about the business itself started earlier and never really stopped. At Thanksgiving the year I signed the lease on my first real commercial kitchen, my mother asked whether I'd thought about something with more security. And Amber, cutting her turkey, added, "Catering isn't really a business, it's a hobby with invoices." I laughed along with the table because that was easier than explaining the 4 vendor contracts I'd negotiated that month or the fact that I hadn't taken a full weekend off in 11 months. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. I told myself the same thing for years. A year later, Amber asked to borrow the company van for a weekend move and returned it 4 days later with a crumpled rear panel and no mention of what had happened until I noticed the damage myself while loading a wedding order. She apologized eventually and offered to cover part of the repair, $600 of a $2,200 body shop bill, a gap I covered without saying much, because saying much by then had never once changed anything. 2 years before the surgery, at our parents' 40th anniversary party, I catered the whole event myself, unpaid, working the kitchen from 4 in the afternoon until well past midnight in a dress I never got to actually wear in front of anyone. Amber spent the evening greeting guests at the door, and at one point I overheard her tell our Uncle Simon that she'd basically run the catering side of things this year, while I was buried in the kitchen. Nobody corrected her. I didn't correct her either, because it was my parents' 40th anniversary, and I didn't want to be the daughter who made a scene about credit at a party I'd spent $400 of my own money decorating. What I told myself, through all of it, was that Amber's need to be seen came from somewhere real, that she'd spent her whole adult life circling an industry our father had mastered, and she never quite could, and that costing me a little credit here and there was a small enough price for keeping the peace in a family that already ran thin on it. I believed, mostly, that as long as the business itself stayed mine on paper, none of the rest of it could actually touch what I'd built. 3 years before the surgery, at my own insistence, I'd named Amber as my medical power of attorney, not because we were especially close, but because she lived 20 minutes from me and our parents lived 4 hours away, and someone needed to be reachable if anything ever happened. I remember signing the form at my kitchen table, sliding it across to her, and saying, half joking, "Try not to need this." She'd laughed and said she wouldn't. I never once considered that the document only authorized her to make decisions about my body, not about anything I owned, and I never imagined I'd need to know the difference. The appendix ruptured on a Sunday night in March, and by the time I reached the emergency room, I was already septic. I was in the operating room within the hour and in the intensive care unit, intubated and sedated, for 5 of the 16 days I ultimately spent in that hospital. I don't remember most of it. What I remember starts with the water stain on the ceiling tile, and then, slowly, over the following days, my mother's voice, a beeping monitor, and Amber's face appearing at the foot of my bed more often than I expected, always leaving again before I was awake enough to ask her anything. I was home for 11 days, still moving carefully, still not cleared to drive, before the first thing didn't add up. A vendor I'd used for 4 years, a linen company out on Route 8, called to confirm new banking details for an invoice, details I hadn't provided. I told him I hadn't changed anything. He read me back a routing number I didn't recognize, attached to an account under a name I did, Edward's Sisters Catering. I sat very still on my own kitchen floor, phone against my ear, thanking him for calling, telling him I'd sort it out and get back to him by Friday. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me more than the routing number did. I logged into my accounting software that same afternoon and found the amendment sitting in the business's document history, filed with the Secretary of State's office 9 days into my hospital stay, while I was still in the intensive care unit, adding Amber Edwards as a 60% owner of the LLC and authorizing a new DBA. The e-signature attached to the filing carried my name and a timestamp, 2:17 in the afternoon, on a Thursday. My hospital chart, which I requested that same week, showed I was under general anesthesia for a wound debridement at 2:17 that Thursday afternoon, 70 miles from the notary's office listed on the form. I didn't call Amber, I didn't call my mother. What I did instead was start reconstructing, quietly, the exact case I already sensed I was going to need. I called Dennis Mitchell first, a forensic accountant a former client had used during a messy restaurant buyout 2 years earlier, and drove myself to his office 19 days after I'd been discharged, against my surgeon's advice about driving, because I wasn't willing to explain over the phone what I needed him to look at. Dennis pulled the filing, the timestamp, my hospital records, and my own cloud backups of the LLC's original operating agreement side by side and said, within 20 minutes, "This isn't a gray area, Monica. This is forgery filed against an incapacitated person. I'd be building a criminal referral, not just a civil one." I told exactly one other person, Emma Howard, my events director, who'd worked beside me for 6 years and had been running the calendar solo while I was in the hospital. Emma told me, quietly, over coffee in my own kitchen, that Amber had shown up at the commercial kitchen twice during my hospitalization, once to grab some paperwork, and once with a signed printer's proof for new uniform patches that said Edward's Sisters Catering. Emma hadn't known what to make of it at the time. She apologized for not calling me. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. I hadn't known what to make of any of it either, from inside a hospital bed. What I deliberately didn't do was warn anyone. I didn't call Amber to ask what she thought she was doing. I didn't tell my father, who I already suspected would want to smooth things over before I'd finished gathering what I needed. I let 6 weeks pass. The same 6 weeks Amber spent, I'd later learn, meeting with a regional hospitality group that was scouting local caterers to bring into a franchise partnership. Presenting herself as co-owner of a business, she'd had no legal claim to 11 days before I nearly died from a ruptured appendix. There was one Sunday, 4 weeks into all of it, when my mother called to tell me how proud she was that, "You girls," had kept the business running while I recovered, her voice bright with a version of events I hadn't corrected yet, and I sat on my back steps, holding the phone away from my ear for a moment before I could trust my own voice enough to answer her. I told her I was glad everyone had pitched in. I hung up and didn't cry, though I came closer than I had at any point since the linen company's phone call. I want you to understand something before we get to the part where this comes apart in front of a room full of people. I wasn't circling Amber to punish her. I was circling her because the only version of this story that would ever actually hold, in a family built on who gets believed, was one I could prove down to the minute. Stay with me, because the night it finally landed, it landed in front of exactly the audience my sister had spent 6 weeks trying to impress. And if you've ever had to wait for the right room to say something true out loud, hit that subscribe button before we get there. The Heritage Valley Culinary Alliance held its annual gala on the second Saturday in May at the Ashford Hotel Ballroom, and Amber had submitted Edward's Sisters catering for the Alliance's Emerging Business Award 7 weeks earlier, 3 weeks after the forged filing, 4 weeks before I found out about any of it. 200 people filled that ballroom that night, including a dozen regional hospitality buyers, half the local restaurant association, and our father, seated at a table near the stage in the good blazer he only wore for events like this one. I hadn't been invited. I came anyway, with Dennis Mitchell beside me and a manila folder I'd assembled over 6 weeks sitting flat against my chest like something I could feel through my dress. I watched Amber walk up to that stage when they called her name, watched her take the small glass award and lean into the microphone and say, "This means so much, especially this year, when my sister and I really had to lean on each other to keep this business alive." And I watched 200 people applaud a sentence that wasn't true in a single word. I didn't wait for her to sit back down. I walked up the side aisle while the applause was still going, and I said, loudly enough for the first 6 tables to hear but not loudly enough to sound like I was performing anything, "Amber, before you sit down, can I see the operating agreement?" The one with my e-signature on it, dated the 9th of March, filed at 2:17 in the afternoon. The room didn't go silent all at once. It thinned out in patches, table by table, as people near the front realized something was happening that wasn't part of the program. Amber's hand tightened on the little glass trophy. "Monica, this isn't the place," she said, and her voice had the particular brightness of someone trying to keep a room from noticing a crack. "It's exactly the place," I said. "You picked it." I handed the folder to the Alliance's director, who was still standing at the podium, clearly unsure whether this was a bit or a crisis. "That's a copy of a Secretary of State filing dated 9 days into my hospital stay, and that's a copy of my hospital chart showing I was under anesthesia at the exact minute it says I signed it. I'd like the Alliance to know before it hands out an award to a business built on a forged document." My father stood up from his table before anyone else did. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at Amber, then at the folder in the director's hands, then back at Amber, in a way I'd never seen him look at either of us before. "Is that true?" he said, not really a question. Amber opened her mouth, then closed it, then said, "I was helping. Someone had to keep it running." "You were unconscious, Monica. Someone had to make decisions." And her voice cracked on the last word in a way that told me she'd believed, at least a little, that this justified all of it. The regional hospitality buyer at the second table, a woman I'd later learn had been 3 weeks from finalizing a franchise partnership with Amber, stood up quietly and left before dessert was served. The Alliance director asked Amber, gently but clearly, to return the award pending a review. Amber didn't argue. She set the small glass trophy down on the podium's edge, and for a moment, before she walked out, she looked less like someone caught than someone finally, fully out of road. In the weeks after the gala, my father called me every few days, something he'd never done in my adult life before that spring. He told me, on the second call, that he'd spent the whole drive home replaying our Uncle Simon's 40th anniversary comment in his head, the one about Amber running the catering side, and realized he'd never once asked me in 9 years how the business was actually doing. I didn't have a clean answer for him. I told him I appreciated the calls anyway, and I meant it, even though 9 years is a long time to wait for a question like that. Dennis Mitchell filed the criminal referral with the county prosecutor's office the week after the gala, and Amber was charged, 6 weeks later, with forgery and financial exploitation of an incapacitated adult, a felony in our state when the fraud occurs against someone who was legally unable to consent at the time. She pleaded to a reduced charge that October, avoiding jail time in exchange for restitution, 5 years of probation, and a permanent record that any future employer or business partner would find with a basic background check. The Secretary of State's office voided the ownership amendment retroactively once Dennis submitted the anesthesia records, restoring Edward's table to sole ownership under my name, exactly as it had always legally been despite the 6 weeks it spent looking otherwise on paper. The restitution order included the $8,000 from 6 years earlier, which the judge allowed onto the record once Dennis produced the wire transfer alongside everything else, a detail that made Amber, according to my mother, angrier than almost anything else in the proceedings. Amber has not spoken to me since the sentencing hearing. My mother says she's working at a wine distributor 2 towns over now, somewhere far enough from the local hospitality scene that she doesn't have to run into anyone from that ballroom. The hospitality group that had been courting Amber for a franchise partnership sent me an email 11 days after the gala, carefully worded, asking whether Edward's table, under its actual ownership, might be interested in a conversation. I read it twice, then let it sit unanswered for 3 weeks, because I wasn't ready yet to build anything with strangers so soon after discovering exactly how little my own sister needed to justify taking what was mine. When I finally did write back, it was to decline, at least for now, and to ask instead about a smaller vendor arrangement that let me keep full control. They agreed to that instead. I still run Edward's table alone, though Emma Howard is a full partner now, with actual equity on paper this time, drawn up by a lawyer I paid for myself and reviewed twice before either of us signed anything. I updated my medical power of attorney the month after the sentencing, not to remove the protection, but to add a line, at Dennis's suggestion, specifying explicitly that it covers medical decisions only and nothing else, a sentence I never imagined I'd need spelled out for anyone in my own family. I think for a long time I believed that being the reliable one meant I'd always be safe, because reliable people don't get taken advantage of. That's supposed to happen to people who are careless or trusting in the wrong direction. I don't believe that anymore. I think what actually kept the business mine, in the end, wasn't that anyone trusted me correctly. It was that I'd already stopped trusting anyone enough to keep only one copy of the truth. Most nights now I cook for one, and I don't rush through it the way I used to when the day's real work happened somewhere else. Last night it was a single lamb chop, a spoonful of the good mustard I never used to let myself buy for just me, and 15 quiet minutes at my own counter before I plated it. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for the version of me that spent 9 years being easy to overlook. I tell it because I know someone listening tonight is currently being the reliable one in a family that's mistaking that for permission, and I want her to know it's allowed to stop being convenient for other people the moment it costs her something real. I'll see you in the next one.